Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another episode of ReaperCast. Today I wanted to talk about something that is quite controversial, to be honest, and this is something that will definitely, draw up a lot of different opinions going against each other. But with that being said, it is something that I've been wanting to cover for quite a while now, because it's just something that I think the state of the game has really just gone on this decline, to be honest, and it really does become a bigger issue if it's left unhandled. So with that being said, we're going to be talking about the different states of archetypes and how it's actually progressed to a point where the archetypes are no longer as interesting as they once were. But before I get started, I would like to remind you guys to drop a like, share, comment and subscribe if you guys actually end up enjoying this video. It really does help the channel. However, with that being said, let's begin. So Yu-Gi-Oh has been around for a very long time now. I mean, it's been over 20 years, and it's definitely come to a point where we pretty much have to bench on the fact that all of these new archetypes that come out, they have to be really creative for them to actually be successful or to even be warranted any interest from certain players out there. But one major thing I actually started to notice is that after a certain period of time, the decks just started becoming less interesting. What I mean by this is these decks didn't really have too much of an exciting theme around it. I mean, sure, they still had their own themes, but they didn't really just spark that much of an interest to players. I mean, we talk about stuff like the Fire Fists being great embodiments of different animals, and we also have the Atlanteans pretty much being a revamp of the Atlanteans themselves. I think that's definitely a really awesome theme. We even have archetypes like the wind-ups, which is centered around these wind-up toys having their effects trigger off and doing all of these different shenanigans, which definitely make it all so interesting, and we even look at the really original archetypes such as heroes being centered around different kinds of heroes that are focused on different elementals, so that's really cool as well. We also have the gladiator beasts being a really cool archetype, having all of these different beasts pretty much dressed as gladiators and being able to combine to form into a bigger fusion monster, which is just really cool as well. However, when it comes to different effects and different play styles, we also have some really interesting things going on as well, and we have stuff like the Raid Raptors being able to focus on rank up magics. That's definitely really awesome. We had something like the Mech Lords being able to actually absorb synchro monsters. We had the Nordic gods, which was an archetype which allowed you to pretty much go into these embodiments of Norse gods, and it was actually really easy to pull off as well. But these days you start to notice that a lot of these newer archetypes, they lack the theme, they lack the uniqueness of their playstyles, and they don't even offer any kind of competitive viability and are more so just throw-ins as filler archetypes for different players to see that, oh, this set actually has extra archetypes out there. But do they necessarily evoke a sense of creativity? Do they actually invoke some sort of interest? One of the things that I've actually noticed is that I've actually taken interest more so in the older decks that I used to play, and I continue to still play and enjoy them even at this current point in time. However, when it comes to the newer archetypes, at first I take some sort of interest and I try to build those decks, but eventually that interest completely falls out and I don't really care about it. In fact, I end up just selling off the core and getting rid of that particular core before I even finish building the deck, despite the fact that I've already done testing online and I know exactly what cards to get to finish off the deck. But even then, it doesn't really motivate me to complete any of those decks. I don't know if that actually occurs for you guys, but it also occurs for some people that I've also known around the local area who also play as well, and they find that a lot of the newer archetypes just don't really have any kind of strong incentive for you to even continue playing. It's just really odd. of course, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly at what set this started being a common theme to it, but I could at least try to dissect it by going through a few sets as an example to actually get an idea of different archetypes out there that have really just not held the interest of different players out there. So one of the sets I actually wanted to start off with here is Infinite Chasers. So Infinite Chasers is one of those special sets. You remember when the first special set came out, like Destiny Lords or Destiny Soldiers, I think it was called. That was a really interesting set. They pretty much gave Dark Lords all new cards here and allowed it to at first be a sub-archetype of sorts where you couldn't really build an archetype out of, but because of Destiny Soldiers, it allowed Dark Lords to actually become its own archetype. Now that was actually a very exciting point because I actually built the deck, I still own the deck, and I still really love the deck right now as well. I have no intention of getting rid of it whatsoever. It's a really fun deck. Even then, the other archetypes in there, while I don't actually own those decks, they were still quite interesting, and even till now I still think back about those particular archetypes. The Abyss Actors definitely have some sort of thing going for them as well, being unique in this whole entertainment pendulum deck. And we also have the Destiny Heroes, which, well, technically that's supporting a really old archetype, but you can clearly see in this current format plenty of Destiny hero players out there, so there's really nothing to really argue about that being not popular. However, when you look at something like the Infinity Chasers, you have the Evil Eyes, the Infinitrack, and you have the Witchcrafters. Out of those three particular archetypes, the Witchcrafters are really the only one that people actually try to build a deck out of. You don't really see too many Evil Eye or Infinitrack decks out there. And the people who actually do build it are really just trying to go into that unique realm of playing something that a lot of people don't commonly play. But the thing is this, even then it's such a small minority group that's actually playing those archetypes. Whereas if you look at a lot of old archetypes, you can actually still find a lot of people actually playing those particular old archetypes that don't even have any popularity or competitive standpoint anymore. And this is something that is kind of backed up by the fact that I'm also part of several Discord groups that I've actually recently joined, and they're basically like archetypal focused Discord groups, and they essentially will have players specifically talking about those particular archetypes. And you know, people who actually have an interest, they can all talk to each other, and you could also improve your decks as well. I mean, I'm sure maybe some of you guys have actually been part of it as well. That's definitely fantastic. I'm part of a few different archetypal Discord groups out there as well, where it's just really fun to actually just, even if you're not talking, you could still get a lot of ideas off the other people who are talking there and how to build your deck as well off that. So it's definitely really fun. But when you see archetypes that are just more of the recent ones, you just don't see too big of a community there. Of course, they're much newer archetypes, so they probably still need time to build up, but you just don't see any kind of activity going on in those particular groups. You don't really see too many people willing to interact, and it's kind of sad really, because you see that these newer archetypes clearly have something that's lacking compared to the older ones. So let's talk about another different set out there. Let's talk about the Mystic Fighters set. We have here the Dragon Maids, the Generators, and the Math Mechs. Now, out of all of these, the one that really drove people in was the Dragon Maids, but the Generators and the Math Mechs didn't really receive too many attention. Even right now, as we see different deck profiles on different channels, if you just type in the search bar for any of a Generator deck or a Math Mech deck, you're not going to find much deck profiles out there. They don't really exist. They're not as recent, and the deck profiles that do actually get shown are pretty much just from the most recent support, which would have been several months ago. Dare I say almost a year ago, and no one has actually bothered to even talk about any of these archetypes or make any videos revolving around them anymore. I mean, I know I've actually made a recent deck profile and test stand videos for the math mechs, but even so, that's a completely different case. I'm someone who built pretty much so many decks out there, which is why I actually had to initiate Project E to start getting rid of decks. But this is also kind of partially linked to the fact that by starting and continuing on with Project E, it's helped me realize that a lot of these newer archetypes really just don't keep me interested anymore. I'm just not really keen on playing them. I'm not keen on actually even trying them out sometimes, and it's quite sad. I mean, the whole thing behind the Dragon Maids was more so just waifu archetypes, and I think that's a lot of the things that's actually allowing Konami to really attract players in with these newer archetypes. You have three particular things. Number one is, are they a waifu archetype? Number two is, do they have any sort of nostalgic factor? And number three is, do they have any kind of competitive factor? And if it fails to meet any of these three kinds of requirements, the decks typically will fail. I mean, you try to think about decks that actually have the uniqueness, it doesn't last for long. Players don't actually play it for long. So let's talk about here the Secret Slayers as well. You have the Adamanticators, the Rika, and the Eldritch. Out of all of these, the Eldritch were the ones that really just had that competitive edge, which keeps people actually interested in that deck. But aside from that, I don't think the theme really draws me in. The Adamanticators for a partial bit also had that competitive viability to a certain point, but eventually it just didn't hold its own and it got phased out. You don't really see people making decks or deck profiles on Adamanticators anymore because of the fact that it just doesn't keep in touch with the competitive realm. It has no nostalgic factor to it, and in terms of uniqueness, it also isn't really there. It kind of has that genericism to that, which is okay of course for certain decks, but at some point in time you kind of want a deck to actually have its own unique playstyle that distinguishes itself from every other deck out there. Now, in terms of the core sets, you have Ignition Assault. So you actually had decks like the Megaliths, the Ancient Warriors, the Ignistas. These were actually quite interesting archetypes to me. You also had the Plunder Patrol, which is also something that's fine and all, but overall, this was something that was kind of heading in that good direction. I was able to stay interested in the Megaliths, the Ancient Warriors, and even the Ignistas. Even at this point, I still want to build those decks. I don't even own those decks, but I still have a desire to continue searching for those cards to build it, so that's definitely a good sign. However, when we look at decks like the Nemesis, which came out in Eternity Code, and if we look at Rise of the Duelist, which didn't even bother to introduce any archetypes, and it instead had to focus on the nostalgic aspect, meaning it had to support a lot of old archetypes like the Raid Raptors, the Abyss Actors, the DDs, the Odd Eyes. That is really what allowed people to even like Rise of the Duelist. Rise of the Duelist is quite a popular set, and it's for the fact that they didn't even have a new archetype in there. It was all just old archetypes being supported. One of the biggest archetypes that drew in a huge nostalgic factor was Gaia the Fierce Knight. It was never truly a proper archetype. I mean, you had these other Gaia cards, but it was mostly used in the Blackluster Soldier ritual deck. However, to actually get cards to allow Gaia the Fierce Knight and obviously Curse of Dragon to merge and become this one new archetype out there, it was able to draw in a lot of nostalgic factor into it. So a lot of people who are actually veteran players would take an interest in this. A lot of people who were able to remember their youth and watch the original show would of course be drawn into the game just for seeing Gaia being remade here. But in terms of the archetypes in here, you did technically have two new archetypes. You had the Melfi and you had the Dogmatica. The Dogmatica had that competitive viability to it. The Melfi is a very interesting case. It doesn't have nostalgia, it doesn't have any competitive viability, but what I will give Melfis is that they did have that novelty behind it. And I think that's kind of something that kind of would draw people in, initially speaking. However, since it's not one of those other 3 factors, it's not going to hold people's interest for long, so most people don't even bother to build a deck out of Melvies. They just want to collect the vanilla card. And of course, we look at a lot of the newer sets out there, like Phantom Rage, which introduces the dual avatar, the Tri-Brigade, the virtual worlds, and the mutant. Now, in terms of the virtual world, because they have that competitive viability, it draws people in. The Tri-Brigades kind of have it as well, but the dual avatar and the mutants are kind of decks out there that don't have anything to go for it. They might have some sort of theme, but it's hard to really draw upon something that could stick it in, you know. And even then, these 2 particular archetypes don't really have anything that's so unique to the point where people really want to play them. They're definitely part of a more niche brand of things, and as a result, it's part of only a very small group of people, part of a minority amount of people who actually want to play those decks out there. And don't even get me started about Blazing Vortex. All of those archetypes were just not interesting whatsoever. I mean, I couldn't even be bothered building them. I mean, I read all of the effects and you could even see videos on them. The Spriggans, the S-Force, the Warrock, the Meteoraptor, they were just not there. I mean, nothing drew me into those archetypes. They felt generic. It felt like they were just putting these archetypes out just to fill up the set. Even when we look at Lightning Overdrive, you didn't really have too much in there. I mean, the Amazements, sure, they might have some sort of minor competitive viability, but even then, it's not really there. I feel like it's eventually going to die down not too long from now. Of course, it's still part of a newer set, but we're just going to have to see what happens later down the line. So I actually want to ask you guys a question. I want you guys to actually think of all of the decks that you own. Which ones are much older and which ones are much newer. The newer ones being the ones that came maybe after mid 2019. And consider which decks you actually play more often. Do you actually play a lot of the newer archetypes out there? Or do you actually find yourself still playing the older archetypes a lot more often? Now the next set that's about to come out is Dawn of Majesty, which has the Despia, the Magikey, the Suship, and the Xiangjian. Now out of all of these, the only one that's really drawing me into it is the Suships, mainly for the novelty factor of it. However, every other archetype in there seem a little lackluster. I did express my interest for the Magikeys, but I'm already starting to lose interest in it. So definitely let me know your thoughts about all of these archetypes that's actually been coming out, a lot of the newer ones compared to the older ones. What do you think should actually happen to allow things to actually change up? Should they just release less new archetypes out there? That way they could maybe focus more of their ideas on creating those archetypes to be more unique? Or perhaps should they just completely stick to supporting old archetypes from this point on and not introduce any more new archetypes? However, I think this video has gone on long enough, so I do thank you guys for joining me today. I hope you all have a fantastic day. I'll see you all next time.